He said to himself and wrote in letters, "Here I am, I've got what talents I have. Why should I be in the United States contributing to the US imperial might? Let me go and do it for my people."
This is Dr. Timothy Brennan, a brilliant author, cultural theorist, and activist. Dr. Brennan is also a professor of cultural studies and comparative literature at the University of Minnesota. He has authored several critically acclaimed books, including Places of Mind, A Life of Edward Said. Inside Arabia and special guest Dr. Mohammad Shaheen, a professor emeritus at the University of Jordan and the editor-in-chief of Al-Majaya Thaqafiyya, sat down with the author to discuss his latest work, Places of Mind, and examine the intellectual life of the late Edward Said, founder of the academic field of post-colonial studies and the most dedicated and visible advocate of the Palestinian cause in the United States until his death in 2003. Please enjoy as Inside Arabia proudly presents a conversation with Timothy Brennan.
My first question to you, Professor Brennan, is how would you describe or comment on Said's attitude on multiplicity of identity, and which one Brennan feels more at ease with?
I think that Edward had a constant battle with questions of identity. It's not only his own identity that he was at war with, but I think he was also very worried about the overemphasis on identity within the American university system, because it got in the way of what he liked to call affiliation versus this other term, filiation. So filiation would have to do with a kind of tribal sensibility, where people are feeling that their solidarities lie only with those who are from the same blood group. He was much more interested and wanted to hold out for different kinds of alliances that are based more on one's position, one's attitudes, and the way that one wishes to orient themselves to the world. Ideas, in short. I think that Edward is often mistaken as someone who is so completely cosmopolitan that his Arab identity didn't matter very much to him. One of the things that I think I knew already, but that I really discovered and kind of dug up the goods on, is how deeply he was invested in his Arab identity. That when people would speak Arabic to him and he spoke back in Arabic and then they would switch to English, he got very angry. He wanted to continue that conversation in Arabic. I hadn't really known that he really systematically apprenticed in the work of the Nada intellectuals, Albert Hourani, Clovis Maqsood, particularly Constantine Zurek, but Abdallah Laroui. These are people that he read very closely and in some ways wanted to model himself on. Philip Hitti, for example, somebody who really kind of paved the way for the kind of intervention that Edward himself made in the public sphere, testifying before Congress, for example, as Hitti did in the 1940s. So I think that Edward was not a person who felt that every single identity was equal to every other, that he could feel at home with anybody, anywhere in the world. I think he was primarily American and Arab, and in equal measure. Although because he was so perfectly assimilated, he often didn't give that impression.
That is the greatest privilege in my life, to be a friend of two great men. And I know that Timothy was not only a student to Edward, but he was his darling student, and the closest to him. And I think, or not myself only, nobody can write this great monumental book except Timothy. And I'm very happy that it has received most favorable reviews in the world, which shows the loyalty of the student to his teacher or instructor or if you don't mind, guru. So yes, we are so happy and privileged to have you, Timothy, crossing the, thousands of miles to be with us. And at least I'm glad that the world is treating us better than yesterday.
Thank you so much. It's so wonderful to be here.
How does Said envisage the role of the intellectual in the society?
Yes, well, that has a lot to do with the way that I wrote the book, and that I felt the most important thing to say about his life was how he became an intellectual and the kind of intellectual that he was. So, like many people who are involved in reading and teaching literature professionally, he tried his hand at writing novels himself and did a pretty good job. He didn't finish them, but I think he didn't finish them as a matter of choice, rather than that he simply failed in completing them. And this has to do with your question, because I think that he believed, particularly in an anti-intellectual environment like that of the United States, that whereas it is usually authors of fiction who get the microphone thrust in their face and are asked their opinion about things, it's typical in the United States for a poet or a novelist to kind of weigh in on world events. This is the way that the humanities are presented. And he railed against that. He chafed against that. He thought that by far the most dynamic, the most creative, and most impactful presence in intellectual life was the intellectual, the critic, the person who had nothing to gain financially, who was a person who possessed a general knowledge and therefore wasn't entering the fray either as a bogus specialist or as somebody with something to gain. And so this role of the intellectual was paramount for him. In Europe, which he often, I think, gave off the aura of being, he came off as kind of European to the American sensibility, even though he's profoundly American.
Yeah, he spoke French.
He spoke French fluently, but it's not just that. It's just that he was always so well put out, and he spoke with a kind of transatlantic English rather than something immediately identifiable as from a region of the United States. So I think that, it's possible to be a Jean-Paul Sartre, in France, or a Jürgen Habermas in Germany. These are people whose opinions are sought by everyone, those in power. They typically write op-eds in the newspaper. And this isn't true in the United States. And this is one of his great achievements is to create a space for this kind of public intellectual to have a mass media following. And he did that against all odds in this anti-intellectual country, the United States.
I was wondering whether this is really related or relevant to his saying, "I am the last Jews."
Jewish intellectual.
The last
I think, he said that on 2 occasions, and the one that was probably the most telling was in a hostile interview with the Israeli journalist Ari Shavit. And I think that what he was trying to say is that, here you've got this grand tradition of Jewish dissident intellectuals, from Spinoza to Trotsky to Marx to Noam Chomsky, today. And here you are up there defending the Israeli state. I mean, you are corrupt. You have already lost the moral high ground. I am following in the footsteps of that dissident Jewish intellectual tradition. I'm joining that group of people. Theodor Adorno, others like that. That's what I stand for, and this is what you stand for. So that's what I think he meant by "I'm the last Jewish intellectual." His story, though, also the story that he wanted to tell about himself and his life as a New York intellectual, right, which is a different, right, the New York intellectuals. When he first got his job at Columbia, they were in full flower. In fact, some of his colleagues were members of that elite group. Lionel Trilling, for example, or Fred Dupee, the founder of Partisan Review. And so he became a New York intellectual. And one of the reasons that he could do that so young is that his story was kind of the negative image of the Jewish story, right? It was about exile. It was about the kind of intellectual perception that is uniquely possible among those who feel themselves not a part of things.
Do you think had Said stayed in the Middle East, in Palestine or other Arab country, would he be as famous as he was
No,
living in the United States?
no.
No.
He
Why
did,
do you
in
think
fact,
that?
try to do it. He wanted very much at one point in his life when he had rediscovered Beirut as a young intellectual, already making his name in the profession in the United States. He went over on I think it was anyway, a prestigious fellowship for a year in Beirut. And so he had a young wife and a new son, and he was becoming acquainted with some of the members of the PLO. And he was, because he was well connected, he married someone who's very well connected in Lebanon who introduced him to all of these people, including Konstantin Zureg. And so he had these ways into the university, of, the American University of Beirut, and he felt that he wanted maybe to go there full time. He said to himself and wrote in letters, here I am, I mean, I've got what talents I have, why should I be in the United States contributing to the US imperial might? Let me go and do it for my people.
Exactly, this is what he said to me
Yeah.
when I first met him in Oxford.
Yes.
June 1983, when people stood to congratulate him for his speech entitled Israel Marches into Lebanon. And they were very appreciative. So he said to me, Mohammed, I should go back to the Arab world and talk instead of talking from East Coast to West Coast. My advice to him, of course, was no, keep where you are.
Yeah.
And the appreciation
Yeah.
he got in the States,
Yeah.
I don't think he will get it, frankly speaking, in the Arab world.
There is that, but then there's other things. I think, Mariam, his wife, told him, don't do it because you'll never be able to go back. And the academic politics is such. There is a lot of resentment and backbiting. He is this guy from New York. He'd already gotten a lot of attention. He's writing for the New York Times, as a very young man. He's having special issues of journals written about him, I mean, as a very young man. And so they're going to try to make life difficult for him. So there was that. But the other thing is this, that when he first turns to organizational politics following the Six-Day War, although he was very political before that, but when he first does that, his instincts are to align himself with the most radical and militant factions of the PLO. He never joined, but he was oriented that way. But his friendship with Iqbal Ahmad convinced him very early that that was not the road to victory. The relationship of forces was most unfavorable. So the only way that the Palestinians could really succeed is to win the moral high ground. And given the direct support that the United States was giving to Israel, that meant affecting American public opinion. So this was his constant mantra, that I know America from the inside, and the PLO leadership needs to know a little bit more about how to orient itself to that public. It's a very important public. It isn't fair that you have to do that, but that's the only way forward, right? So they would take this, the PLO leadership would take this as his being too American, too out of touch. But he's saying, look, I understand that. I understand that I'm working at a distance, but there's an advantage to that.
But how does his work, Said's work, impact the progress of peace in the Middle East, or especially Palestinian Israelis?
I think it does in some big ways and some small ways. Now, I will say, though, as a proviso, that I don't think that he materially changed conditions on the ground. He did not succeed in that. But he did some very important things. He changed the conversation in the United States completely, and he made it professionally respectable to criticize Zionism. In fact, it even became a genuinely popular position in many places. That's brand new. He humanized the PLO leadership for an American public. You know, he fell out with Arafat later.
He was against Oslo.
That is putting it mildly. I think he called the PLO leadership like Bouthelezi, you know, the head of a Bantustan, you know, a complete quisling, right? A traitor after Oslo. But before that, despite his misgivings about the top-heavy nature of the PLO leadership, he fought hard to make Arafat appear to the American public like what he was, you know, a smart, funny, versatile individual, right? So I think that's a big thing. Of course, he also was considered by many people in the American State Department to be the unofficial go-between. So, I mean, there are PLO representatives who had that job, who were supposedly the people that the State Department would go to convey messages to the leadership, but they didn't. They went to him.
He was also within the group which went with Carter.
Yeah, well, there was an initiative by Cyrus Vance, who was the then Secretary of State under the Carter administration, to come up with a settlement that would actually mean that, as far as the United States was officially concerned, that Israel needed to withdraw to pre-1967 borders. This is huge. And you know, the PLO leadership, Arafat particularly, rebuffed him, said no. So anyway, there are those moments. Something else, too, something that he was often criticized for, he was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, which is typically a very conservative, pro-US imperial policy body. And so a lot of people said, how can you do this? You know, you are part of the enemy.
It's a very complex relation.
Very complex.
Yeah.
And he says, look, these are people who are opinion makers. They're people who are connected directly to those who are making all of the decisions at the highest levels of government. Why should I not be speaking to them? If they invite me, I want to talk to them. And he says, and in any way, you PLO leaders who are saying I shouldn't be doing this, you're struggling to get into that same position. You want that invitation, but you don't have it.
And going back to the question of politics, one particular or one point which Miriam particularly appreciates about books, about your book, is that he got involved in politics, not as most people say after June War,
right,
but before that.
Yes, he did.
And this is something that, I mean, the only one who mentions it too. How much can you get out of his writing before June 67 war? Are there enough material which in fact prove as evidence?
I think so. Of course, this would be open to later researchers to dispute. But on the one hand, there's testimony from his childhood friends that say that he was constantly talking about the plight of the Palestinians, constantly identifying with the political struggle of the Palestinians, and everyone who knew him closely said so. Now, Edward is a kind of an interesting character in many ways, but one of them is that he chose what part of himself that he wanted to reveal to certain people and not others. So this was not other people's impressions, but it was those who were lucky enough to have this side of him be expressed. Next, he's writing very brilliantly about the Suez crisis in the college newspaper when he's at Princeton. So this is before the 1967 war, right? Plus, one of the things that I had the privilege of doing in writing this book is to go back and get all of his transcripts from, you know, his undergraduate, graduate days. And this included a lot of his student notes and student papers. And there's a running motif through those notes and papers of his strong identification with being Arab, his strong desire to go back to the Middle East and work as a medical missionary, the kind of embarrassment, in a way, to be studying literature when what people really needed was a political change on the ground, and how important it was for him, even in those student days, to learn from the literary figures of the past who were at the same time political figures, right? Which is one of the reasons why later he's so interested in Jonathan Swift, who is both a satirist and a novelist and a poet, but also a diplomat, a man of action, somebody who was close to the halls of power. And so these motifs taken in ensemble show me that he was much more political than he lets on. And part of the misconception is his own doing, because when he does turn to full-time, as it were, organizational work after 1967, after the Six-Day War, the Nakba, he derides himself for not having done more earlier. But people misunderstand this. It's not like he's starting politics, it's just that he never did it in so systematic a way.
You mentioned Jonathan Swift. I mean, he was quite, really fond of him. But I wonder whether he was interested in his attitude towards politics, or, as I believe, in the way he handled language.
Good point. That's a very good point. I mean, obviously, Jonathan Swift's politics could not be farther from Edward's, and this is maybe a kind of running motif throughout his life. He's attracted to the people, he's perversely attracted to people that he does not like and whose politics he does not share. Charles Mallock, for example, but also Jonathan Swift, Joseph Conrad. But the thing about Swift, and this I think is what you're getting at, is that Swift was not only somebody who demonstrated in his own performance as a writer a kind of rhetorical deftness, but who himself, in his letters and commentary, commented on what is the most important thing to remember about language as a political figure, who's also a literary figure. And this had to do with the conversational element and how closely eloquence is tied to plainness of speech. So to me, growing up in the years that I did and being a part of the university community as a graduate student where everyone was involved in abstruse, difficult continental philosophies and theories, one of the things I always admired about Edward, even then, is that in his essays, even the technical, theoretical essays, he was so easy to understand. He was so open and plain and always thinking about the broader audiences, finding a way to turn complex ideas into something that normal people could understand. And if anything, that trajectory of his life only became more and more so. I noticed that as the years went on, he became simpler and simpler and simpler in his public speaking. So I think he learned that not only from Swift, but I think Swift was one of the people who...
I thought it was brilliant to associate him with Saussure
Yeah.
and Nietzsche,
Yeah.
which is really something unprecedented.
His relationship with Nietzsche is one that I have trouble with, just because I despise the philosophy of Nietzsche. I can't get over what he's really attempting to do. He's an aristocrat, Nietzsche is, and defends slavery, and really was involved in a kind of European triumphalism, right, in the age of Germany's entry into the colonial contest. So, I mean, this is what Nietzsche actually is. I don't think that Edward, there's not a hint in any of Edward's writings about this side of Nietzsche. He's only interested in Nietzsche, the unpredictable naysayer, right? The one who's constantly keeping you off guard with an ironic mask, I think is what he gets
He
from
also
Nietzsche.
had contradictory feelings. For example, he admires the Orientalists, but he
criticizes the
them as
Orientalists.
being, their narrative as being inaccurate. I mean, this is very complex.
Well, I think that's very, very perceptive, I think, to say that, because I think most people assume after reading Orientalism or knowing something about the arguments of Orientalism that he would be involved in a blanket condemnation of these misrepresenters and caricatures of the Arab world. I think that it's, first of all, the case that there are very different treatments of the different Orientalists in that book. I mean, the way that he talks about Ernest Renan, for example, is one way. He doesn't like Renan very much, but the way he talks about Raymond Schwab is completely different. It's more adulatory. Yes, I think that he is really trying to say that even these abstruse scholars who spend their time minutely poring over texts in the library are able, in the hands of really creative people like these Orientalists that he looks at in Orientalism, to create this grand cultural drama of the imagination, right? Something that is sort of awesome in its erudition and sort of enviable in the broad connections that it makes. And so really what he's trying to say is, it's possible for people in the humanities to have a political impact. That maybe the Orientalists didn't invent all of the demeaning portraits of Arabs. Maybe they only were reinforcing those that were already in circulation. But they did have this power to give it an authority, right? There's something about the intellectual act of creating authoritatively a position.
But does that serve the colonialism, or
it does.
In one way or another?
It does, but it's also something to learn from. I mean, let's not forget that two of the people that he considered his mentors, people that he was kind of like a little schoolboy around. He admired their work so much, right? Jacques Berck and Maxime Rodinson. They're Orientalists, right? In fact, neither one of them liked Orientalism because they felt that he hadn't really understood the entirety of the field, and he overemphasized literature in his portrait, that really the Orientalists were involved in a much broader area studies that, And so they were quite critical, even though they're politically coming from the same place. But no, I think that exactly the kind of point that you're making is borne out in many ways, but one of the ways would be this relationship he had with those two.
You mentioned, I mean, you said, or you perceptively demonstrated it in your book, how Edward makes complex things simple. But sometimes when we come across the simple terms, we get stuck. I mean, like right back. I don't think, even, at least Arabs haven't grasped this, or grasp and regrasp, or the contrapuntal. How did you make or could make them more intelligible to the reader?
Well, I hope my answer to this doesn't sound evasive, but I think that one of the rhetorical tricks that someone who is involved in creating a new sensibility, which I believe he was doing, one of the creative tricks is to manufacture vague coinages, right? Like filiation and affiliation, like the contrapuntal and permission to narrate, and one could go on, right? That those kinds of coinages, partly through repetition, partly by his kind of cajoling way of talking around those issues, right, means that even those who don't completely understand them are impelled to quote them and to make them their own and to feel their way through it. So he's able to convey, in other words, a sensibility without you understanding every detail of what's entailed, of what's entailed by these. I think that was a deliberate strategy on his part, and I think it's related also to the way that he, following in the steps of Joseph Conrad, learned how to wear masks and to hide from people, the entirety of what he really believed, which is to say that in spite of my citing before plain speaking and directness, that he was involved also in a kind of calculated, tactful evasion very often, right? So this especially showed itself in his reluctance within his own field, at any rate, to confront enemies openly or polemically. Now, he does do that when it comes to people like Bernard Lewis and those who are just, kind of directly involved in supporting the IDF or something. But he's inclined to win people over by supplying a criticism that doesn't hurt, that is muffled, that where there are avenues to escape, where there's plausible deniability. Now, you could say that that is a form of opportunism or cowardice, but I think given the fact that most people rightly consider him to be an anti-colonial rebel and a dissident, and much closer to the Marxists in his intellectual life than he ever let on, I think that's the general impression of Edward, and it's the correct impression, but it allowed him to survive. And he is, after all, doing these things in the height of the rightward trends of the Reagan-Thatcher era, which is also something to keep in mind.
What would you say to some of the reviews who were unfair to the book? Fortunately, there are not many. On my mind is the New York Times review, which they say that Places of the Mind is a dissertation. I mean, طبعا I talked to Maryam about it, and we agreed that it was jealousy. But what would you say to them in general? I mean, would you keep, maintain silence over that?
Well, I wrote the New York Times, and they didn't publish the letter. But there's a couple things about this. The guy's name is Dwight Garner, and thankfully his review was anomalous. But there's a couple things. He's close friends with a guy who just came out with a biography on Philip Roth, which has now been pulled from the shelves because the guy was involved in a sexual scandal that took place at Dwight Garner's home. So I think that partly what Garner was doing was trying to clear the path in this season of biographies for his friend's biography. Okay, and I think that's partly what's going on. But I don't think it's only that. I think that Dwight Garner is, in fact, a perfect representative of the anti-intellectual bent in the United States. That here's a guy who has an undergraduate degree. I mean, he wouldn't know what a dissertation looked like, right? So, which is a point I made in the letter that I wrote. I said, he's calling this a dissertation, but how would he know? So, so it's kind of like lowbrow, low-bud appeal here. Probably not political. I don't think that he was trying to do it in because he didn't like Said's politics. It was something else. But I think that what was most telling about that review is that he crammed that review full of all of the life details taken from my biography that he said the biography lacked. So it was fundamentally dishonest. I think the bigger question is this, that, I have to say this last point, and that is that I was asked by the agent who called me up to write an intellectual biography, not a straight biography. And that is what I sold to the publisher, Farrar, Straus and Giroux. That doesn't mean that you don't include things from the person's life, and I think there's a lot of that. A fair reader will say that there's a lot of that in the book. But I did think that the dominant narrative arc of the book should be about how he became an intellectual, why he thought being an intellectual mattered, and how his earlier, writing and thinking about literary theory and texts of literature was directly responsible for arming him to become the public intellectual and partisan of the Palestinian movement that he became. I mean, these are directly connected. They're not two different things.
Suppose you were asked or you wanted to rewrite this unprecedented biography, what would you add and what would you omit?
Well, in addition to my being asked to write an intellectual biography, I also felt, when given that task, that it shouldn't be one of these really long biographies. But if I had if I was given the carte blanche to write about every aspect of his life, I would have included many more lengthy anecdotes about how he was in conversation. That is, I would recount actual meetings that took place between him and other people and sort of dramatically relive them, okay? I would also look at some of the personal relationships that he had with especially novelists. Some of the most interesting stuff in the archive has to do with these long love letters. They're not romantic love letters. They're love letters, like intellectual love letters between Nadine Gordimer and him. That's a very interesting relationship. It's way beyond cordial. It's special. Like I say, not romantic, but really, there's something revealed about Edward in his letters and in his conversations that if I had a lot more length, I would have given. I would have looked at, some of the encounters that he had with his kids that showed what his Americanness looked like in practice. Okay, there's his romantic affairs. I mean, there's many of them. I mentioned one of them in here, but there were others as well, and conversations that he had with people about them. Yeah, I mean, there's really a lot of material that I had that I didn't put in the book because it was a different kind of book.
What you seem to have struggled and succeeded in doing is the hostile attitudes, for one reason or another, towards Saeed. It's true that you've been, most faithful and loyal to him and to the noble message, but you have been fighting a very good battle against the battle itself, which Saeed fought. And I'm happy from the reviews that you succeeded.
Thank you.
And congratulations.
Thank you.
One last thing from beginning, from Erickson, you remember Erickson's remark? Erickson says, our first, how does one take a great man, quote, for what he was, question mark. The very adjective seems to imply that something about him is too big, too awful, too shiny, to be encompassed. This is your, I think, the most challenging things you have. But these are words of Edward in his beginning. So, I thought you've been aware of doing this job of Saeed being too big, too awful, too shiny to be encompassed.
That's a strange point of view, it seems to me. I don't think that when we call a person great that it necessarily implies those negative things or those things that cause a certain, how could I put it, hermeneutics of suspicion. I find it a rather, it's very much the case that most of the people who saw Edward in his prime and interacted with him would have not hesitated to call him great in a number of ways. One, his ability to think on his feet, the kind of total package of his performativity and his charm and his looks and his ability to run circles around the pundits on the nightly news programs. Something about him too was his ingenuousness, right? In the postmodern age of layered ironies and the lack of all convictions. He's somebody who was an old-fashioned believer in ideas, and I think this is one of his great rhetorical strengths. But I think that I'm a little sensitive to the idea that because I studied with him, that he always was this kind of looming figure of greatness that it was hard for me to be critical of. I'm very critical of Edward. I think both in the biography and also in life. And you know, I wrote something like 13 essays about him even before writing this thing. Some of those essays I wrote when he was still alive, and I criticized him. So I think that there's moments of Edward biting his tongue and not saying what he needed to say to the profession at a certain time in order to avoid being canceled, you know. And I didn't like that. I didn't respect that. I think that, you know, there's other things. There's the vanity, and there's the constant need to be praised, which often led him to trust people that he shouldn't trust because he was susceptible to flattery. And there's things like this. I think this is a part of it as well. But in the end, I think that one has to simply give the devil his due and acknowledge that he changed things profoundly. He gave people the model within the university to become something more than a scholar, something that actually made a difference in the world, right? He held out to the intellectual as the guarantor of the historical record and the changer of the itinerary, and the one who can think of possible worlds, not ones that actually exist.